Hi, my name is Hugo Shi, and I wanted to give a very, very brief tutorial on setting up JupyterHub. This is going to just cover what it looks like from a high level. Um, we are going to link to an article that goes through the steps in more detail. So first of all, when you're setting up JupyterHub, you have two options. There's 0 to JupyterHub, which is a set of instructions for setting up JupyterHub running on Kubernetes. There's also the littlest JupyterHub, which is setting up a smaller JupyterHub instance on a single instance. For your company, assuming you have a small team, I would recommend that you start with the littlest JupyterHub. It's most often what people need. And for most teams, you don't need to deal with the complexity of Kubernetes. The biggest issue with the littlest JupyterHub is that you're basically creating a shared server that all your teammates can use for compute. And it does mean that that machine can run out of resources. You can have some users max out the memory, which will cause other people's kernels to crash. But until that happens, it's probably a much better option for you. But at some point, you are going to need, or at some point, you may need to go with Kubernetes. And so the rest of this is going to go through that approach. Here's a brief summary of what 0 to JupyterHub looks like. Or at least our flavor of it. Our article goes through how to set up an EKS cluster, which is a Kubernetes cluster managed by AWS, running in AWS. This runs in a VPC in your account. We recommend that you create VPCs with private and public subnets. That way, the nodes themselves will live in the private subnet, which means that they are not directly accessible to the internet, which is good for security reasons. But the public subnet means that you can have things like load balancers and internet gateways that will both let your nodes communicate to the outside internet and let the outside internet communicate with the nodes. When you go through this setup, you are going to create an EKS cluster. That EKS cluster, the cluster itself, this is the control plane running inside AWS, will need an IAM role that you will create that gives it the ability to interact with other things like scaling up and scaling down nodes or controlling the worker nodes. You will also have to create worker node pools. And these are the machines that actually make up your Kubernetes cluster. And that worker node pool will have a separate IAM role that's tied to the instance. This is also a convenient place that you can add permissions. For example, if you want every machine in your cluster to be able to load data from an S3 bucket. Once you have the Kubernetes cluster set up, the last step is actually installing JupyterHub. So what does this look like? Your local machine, you're going to need the AWS CLI. You'll need to install kubectl, and you'll need to install Helm. So the AWS CLI is the command line that you use to interact with AWS. For these purposes, AWS CLI is mainly used to authenticate you with the Kubernetes cluster. kubectl is a command line utility that lets you interact with the Kubernetes cluster. It lets you see what's in it, delete resources, create resources. And Helm is a package manager for the cluster. So Helm will let you install software on that cluster. JupyterHub has been published as a Helm chart. So our article will go through using Helm to install the JupyterHub Helm chart. The last thing I want to call out is that you may or may not need the cluster autoscaler. Probably if you've gotten to the point of setting up an EKS cluster, you're going to want a cluster autoscaler because provisioning more hardware is one of the goals. And the cluster autoscaler is just a container that runs in your cluster. It looks for containers that have not been scheduled yet because there isn't enough hardware, and then it provisions more machines. And then when machines are not being fully utilized, it'll sort of move containers around and then shut down the machines you no longer need. That's it for the summary. Check out the article. It'll go through step by step how to do all these things so that you can get JupyterHub up and running at your company.